Blagojevich, the state budget, and corruption. We talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the weekly program on state politics and government and how it might just affect you. Joining me this week on Capitol View is Jerry Nowicki, Bureau Chief for Capital News, Illinois. Welcome, Jerry.
How you doing?
Also, Charlie Weaver, retired director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at the University of Illinois Springfield and former state government reporter for the Chicago Sun-Times. Welcome, Mr. Wheeler.
Oh, it's always good to be here.
Good. Let's jump right into it with Blagojevich and get that out of the way. Some folks might want him out of the way anyway, but he was released from prison this week on orders of Donald Trump, and somewhat of a media spectacle ensued up in Chicago. There were even reporters who managed to get tickets on the plane taking him back from prison to Chicago, where he held a press conference almost simultaneously with Governor J.B. Pritzker holding his annual budget address. A lot of publicity, a lot of talk about Blagojevich, not a lot of support for the president's decision to commute his sentence and release him early, especially here in Illinois. Is this just a one-day bubble, Blagojevich bubble, and then he goes back to the wherever it was he belonged in the first place, or is this something that's going to have legs? Are we going to be dealing with Blagojevich for any length of time down the road? What do you think?
I'll give you credit for an understatement when you say somewhat of a media spectacle. In a short answer, no, I don't think he's going to go quietly. He's prohibited from running for state office, but he's going to find something to run for, some sort of book to write, and some way to keep his face on television screens and computer screens for some time.
My secret hope against hope is William Barr is in trouble, not in trouble, but considering resigning. Blagojevich has a law degree. I'm not sure if the Attorney General of the United States can be a former felon, but wouldn't that be delicious? Blagojevich is the Attorney General in place of William Barr. But what do you think, Charlie? I mean, where does this guy have to go from here?
I think Blagojevich's law license has probably been suspended. He's probably been disbarred with his felony convictions. Sure. No, he'll continue to be a spectacle. That's what he is. He's a showman. In that sense, he and Donald Trump are alike. They're both people who love the spotlight, who don't really care about details, and who don't want to get involved with the nitty-gritty work of doing government. And in my judgment, they're both very narcissistic. Mm-hmm. They love hearing about themselves. And I think to give the credit where it's due, I think you really have to look kind of with awe on Patty Blagojevich, Rod's wife, who really went out of her way to try and compliment Trump. She'd go on Fox News, and you could tell that's exactly who she was talking to about how this corrupt prosecution went on. And as a matter of fact, Blagojevich, not too recently, penned an op-ed in which he likened his prosecution to the impeachment hoax against Donald Trump. And he suggested that had Democrats, this current crew of congressional Democrats, been around when Abraham Lincoln was president, they would have impeached Abraham Lincoln.
Well, he is also a political prisoner, in his own words.
Yeah. No, Blagojevich, I thought he was a disaster as governor. I thought the things that he did, everybody talks about, how he tried to sell a Senate seat, get a campaign contribution to appoint somebody to the Senate. Finally, he appointed Roland Burris, who probably was the only guy in Illinois who would accept it. And in my mind, that was not nearly as bad, although that got all the national publicity and everything, as him trying to shake down the head of a children's hospital for contribution, holding up money to go and care for 6 kids to try and shake money out of this guy. And I thought that was probably the most despicable of this long laundry list of things he did.
Yeah. You know, if there's a silver lining to what he did, and I'm not suggesting that there is, but if you got a scrape, I think one thing that he might have done is he did kind of expose the dark underbelly, so to speak, of Illinois. He wasn't the only one that went down. I mean, you had Stu Levine that went down, you had Bill Cellini that went down, you had other folks that went down who'd been around for a while that they deserved to go down, and they did. I mean, you're right. I think the Senate seat, Obama's Senate seat, that's got all the headlines nationally. But folks that have been here in Illinois know that I think it went way deeper, way wider, and got way more serious.
Yeah, and I would look at it. I would say, I don't think Blagojevich exposed anything. I think Blagojevich was just the latest in a long string of people who were exposed by the hard work of the Justice Department, U.S. attorneys in Chicago. The FBI, they're the ones, and citizens who had the courage to come forward and complain. There was a woman who was the head of a hospital in DuPage County in Naperville who Blagojevich tried to shake down, and she thought that was wrong. She wore a wire for the feds. That kind of thing, having the courage to come forward and say, hey, I don't think this is appropriate.
Yeah. You know, I think when all was said and done, he left the state much worse on some levels. I mean, certainly financially, he took pension holidays like they were going out of business. Fiscally, he left the state a worse place. Reputation-wise, he left the state a worse place, but then our reputation wasn't that great to start with, given our previous history of corruption. But on the other hand, I think you know, let's give him credit for at least one thing. I mean, some reforms, tiny ones, but important ones, I think, took place. The Freedom of Information Act, for example, was strengthened somewhat, and Blagojevich was used as leverage to get that. Even though they were kind of apples and oranges on some level, it did result in at least a little bit of reform. So is there anything good about him that we can think about?
I would say, in my judgment, again, you look at George Ryan, who also went to jail for corruption. In my mind, Ryan went to jail for the equivalent of going into the 7-Eleven and rifling the gumball machine. Blagojevich went to jail for going into the 7-Eleven and sticking him up and cleaning out the cash register. I didn't think there was much comparison at all. And Ryan accepted, he didn't consider himself a political prisoner. He didn't have any of this, oh, woe is me stuff. He was, I think, misled by some of his aides who were behind these schemes. Blagojevich and three of his friends, the documents laid out in the prosecution showed that he and his friends sat around like we're sitting around here and say, okay, Bruce, we're going to elect you governor, and here's how we can make money off it.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was just...
So-and-so wants X, how much Y can we get in exchange for that?
Yeah, so that was a lot worse. And what he did financially was really bad. I think Bruce Rauner was worse on that score for the 2-year budget impasse that we're trying to dig out of still. But yeah, Blagojevich was, I thought he was not a good governor almost from the get-go. And so did the Democrats pretty much right off the bat.
Well, and Bruce, you had brought up that, the people of Illinois kind of know better than nationally.
Yes.
And that's especially true for the people you speak to at the Capitol when this pardon happened, especially Leader Durkin from the House Republicans from Western Springs. He was one of the most critical of either party, any party, of the president's decision to pardon Blagojevich. I think he has a record as a prosecutor, and he just said, the president's not looking for votes in Illinois come November. I think that's what it comes down to. And that's Leader Durkin speaking, and he said it sends the wrong message at a time in Illinois when I think we're going to talk later about a lot of investigations that are ongoing, some indictments, some lawmakers that have been indicted and charged, raids are ongoing, a lot of federal activity, and Leader Durkin says this sends the message that you don't got to pay your debt to society no matter what corruption you get.
Yeah, and Durkin was in a good position to be able to comment on it because he was the lead Republican on the House committee that investigated Blagojevich's activities and ultimately came up with the impeachment resolution, which the House approved, 114-1. And the one was Deb Bell, who was Rod Blagojevich's sister-in-law.
And folks have been saying 14 years was too much, 14 years was excessive. But I recall at the time looking at the sentencing guidelines, what was called for. He had got a break at sentencing. 14 years was less, significantly.
than the guidelines.
than what the guidelines called for. He had already, in a sense, gotten his break. And Jerry, I think you bring up a really good point. Would this have happened if Illinois wasn't so, so deeply blue that Trump has no chance of getting the electoral votes? If this had been a swing state or close to it, would he have made the decision that he made yesterday? Is there any, or this week, is there any good answer to that?
I don't think there's any way to possibly know that, but nobody seems to have liked the idea. I think Senator Durbin, U.S. Senator Durbin, had been the only one that I can remember going on record at any point and saying, the sentence was too long, at least in terms of Illinois dignitaries and politicians.
Yeah.
And his statement kind of, edged around those former comments. He said, Blagojevich committed a crime. He did a long time in prison. Basically, we want to see Trump's tax return. So he edged around that pretty heavily. But other than that, nobody thought it was a good idea to let him out.
I mean, you look at Arizona, for example, where one of the first examples of clemency from Trump was the pardon of Joe Arpaio before he went to prison. And when that happened, I thought to myself, and perhaps other people did too, Arizona has been a fairly thorough Republican state. Would this be an attempt to drum up support there, or was there any real price to be paid for giving clemency to somebody like Joe Arpaio in Arizona? I think maybe the angles are different between the two states, but it's hard, I guess, for me to imagine that Trump didn't look pretty carefully at the politics of this and decide, this isn't going to hurt me.
Right.
Well, and I think part of it too is he could be setting the stage for other pardons on down the line.
Yeah.
I mean, his friend Roger Stone was sentenced to 44 months in prison.
Yeah, 40 months today.
Is anybody taking any bets that he'll do any time? I mean, given what Trump has said,
Yeah, so.
And that's what the Sun-Times editorialized, I think, shortly after the the commutation. He wasn't pardoned, the conviction's still there. And, that could be the case, who knows, but he's, like you said, he's very calculating in the way he acts, so.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the point about Durbin is a good one. Durbin has stood almost alone. I believe Senator Durbin also argued on behalf of George Ryan when George Ryan's wife took ill that, hey, this is time to let this person out of prison. So this isn't Durbin's first shot at this. However, not all politicians, particularly Republicans, Durkin being one example, agree with this. And there was an event, I believe, I can't recall the particulars of it in Illinois, where Trump, or I believe it was Trump, had appeared in a fundraiser and asked how many folks support me letting Blagojevich go, and no hands went up. And he was in amongst the donors and high political figures, some of whom yesterday, the Republican congressional delegation issued a joint statement yesterday saying not a good thing to have happen. Why do you think they would have issued a joint statement as opposed to individual statements? I mean, can we read anything into that?
I think strength in numbers, and Representative LaHood from around this Springfield area, he had said at one point in August when the president was thinking of the pardon, he had said, I talked to him. I told him this isn't a good idea. I told him Blagojevich deserves the time he served. So I think it's probably easier for them with strength in numbers to issue that statement.
Yeah. One thing I wonder about is Rodney Davis. He's in a tight race here in central Illinois. He signed this statement, all the Republican delegation did. And he's the one, perhaps arguably, who has hitched his wagon most closely to Donald Trump. Certainly in his reelection, he had the vice president come in and speak on his behalf. Does this create any kind of particular issues, do you think, for Rodney Davis, or is this that's just Trump being Trump and there's no real effect come the fall time?
I don't know. That'll be for the voters to decide. I can't really predict what they're going to think of it and whatnot.
I would guess that if you're a Trump supporter, whatever he does is fine.
Yeah.
And so you're willing to give Rodney Davis a pass because he criticized Trump about this because he's been such a loyal disciple otherwise. Mm-hmm. And if you think Donald Trump is the worst president we've ever had, you're not going to vote for Rodney Davis anyhow.
Yeah. does this hurt Rodney Davis with the president? You know,
Yeah.
he's come out and criticized him. What could the fallout from that be? Who knows? You know, this isn't the only case of corruption or the hangover of corruption, I guess. Blagojevich's case having been decided some time ago. There's a developing case, search warrant served last week, or subpoena, I believe, up near Chicago, looking for emails and other documents held by one Raymond T. Nice, former campaign worker for Michael Madigan, House Speaker. Mr. Madigan's name is in that, is on those documents, looking for records. So are a lot of his top lieutenants, current and former. Tim Mapes, I believe, is former chief of staff. Mr. Quinn, who was a former employee of the state who had worked for Madigan in some capacity. Does this move the ball forward much? I mean, this appears to be tied to the ComEd probe. Clearly, they're still gathering material here. Is there any way of knowing at this point in time whether this is incremental, whether this is how important this might be? When, if at all, will we see any indictments?
There's so much clear and obvious activity going on that I think it'd be utterly pointless for anyone to speculate as to what's going to come next. Clearly, there will be something.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I have no idea. All I'm doing is watching and taking it all in, seeing who's named in what subpoenas, and seeing who's going to be indicted.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if I could make any kind of a reasonable prediction, after we're finished here, I'd go out to the OBT parlor and start betting money on horses.
Well, and it's going to become much easier for you with the OTB coming up. You'll be able to bet, if our governor's right, perhaps on March Madness.
Yes.
Sports gambling is coming around, which is the other big news, I think, this week that got somewhat overshadowed, but it's perhaps some of the most important news, which is the governor's budget address. And he was Mr. Optimistic, I think, when he presented this. There is no fiscal issue so large that we can't solve it. Anybody who says that is wrong, and you know, lots of optimism exuded there, despite $130+ billion unfunded pension issue, which the governor, you know, did acknowledge. He gave us two budgets, so to speak, here. One, here's what we do if voters approve the graduated income tax come November. Here's what happens if we don't. I didn't sense the same huge embrace of the budget at this point in time, and it's just a starting point. I mean, this isn't the end all
Right.
be all. You guys have crunched some of the numbers. What do you think?
So I think it is pretty. There are some parallels to last year. So the graduated tax budget spends $42 billion if that passes, because that accounts for $1.4 billion that comes in through roughly half the fiscal year.
Mm-hmm.
Without that tax, they're looking at roughly $40.6 billion in spending.
Mm-hmm.
And the key contention for many lawmakers right now is that the evidence-based funding formula for K-12 schools calls for $350 million added to the formula each year in state government spending on education. And the way Pritzker has it right now, that is $200 billion should the graduated tax fail. So they're putting
$200 million, you mean?
$200 million.
Okay.
Sorry.
$200 million increase, yeah.
Extra dollars from what they spent on it last year goes to the formula this year, rather than the $350 million that they're asking, that the state law calls for as a target. So in like last year, he had put out a pension ramp extension in his first budget address, and it was widely panned. I think this is being treated in the same way. I would expect to see some retreat there because, you know, Republicans are already calling him holding hostage $150 million for K-12 education as a condition of voters, you know, say, hey, you'll get your education funding if you vote for my graduated tax.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, $150 million in the scheme of things, and I'm not going to call it chump change, but in the context of a $40 billion budget, is, you know, it's not exactly a rounding error, but it's close to it. DCFS gets some extra money as well?
DCFS gets, what is it, 148 million more to hire more caseworkers, principally because, as I'm sure everybody knows, last year 123 kids who had contact with the agency died, and that's just one kid dying is horrible to have that number. And part of it is caseworkers are overworked. They're not well supervised. The training is lacking.
They're not well paid.
Yeah, and the governor pointed out currently there's only 2 labs where you can have a simulation for a caseworker to go in, and there's actors pretending to be a family in trouble, shouting at each other, kids crying and all that. What do you do? One's here in Springfield, he's up in the Chicago area. He said we're going to do another one down in Carbondale, or in southern Illinois, he said, to help better the training that these people have. In my mind, that's the toughest job in the world, is to go and be a caseworker. And I have a lot of admiration for people who do that. But that's an example of something he's trying to do.
Yeah, and frankly, that's on a long list. I have a long list, and that's one of them. I couldn't do that.
Yeah.
Couldn't be a police officer, a prison corrections officer. Those are all jobs that are thankless and oftentimes don't pay what they should.
It is important to note that that $147 million for DCFS would be independent of the graduated tax income in Pritzker's budget. So that's probably part of the reason why that $150 million extra for funding has to be held in reserve.
Well, one of the things that the Republicans argue is that the governor says we're going to have almost $700 million in new revenue. Why do we have to hold anything? Well, 2 things we just spoke of. We spoke of the full pension payment. That's $500 million right there. DCFS 147, say. So what does that come up to? That comes out to 647, say. And the governor was predicting that we would get 656 million in new dollars. So it's already spent already.
And that's just through natural revenue growth.
Natural revenue growth,
not new taxes at this point. That's independent of the graduated tax.
Well, you know, Rauner was infamous for holding hostage things to budget woes. The $150 million for schools, I've heard at least one person say, "Well, it's just another Rauner sort of thing." Not as severe, but
apples and oranges, in my judgment.
Yeah. You know, there are a few other things that came out yesterday. He said with the onset or advent of illegal adult cannabis, the state expects to get $36 million in its general fund from cannabis taxes.
That's not quite accurate.
$10 million to the backlog too. So it was, I think it was about 46 general fund, but that's only 45% of the cannabis revenue.
Correct, less than half goes.
And a big chunk of the rest of the money goes to these programs that have developed to help, I guess you would say, get some of the benefits of being involved in the cannabis industry on the ground in the communities most harmed by the war on drugs. So low-income communities, particularly in Chicago, there's going to be training for people. There's going to be capital programs to provide grants. You want to start a dispensary? Here, we'll help train you. We'll provide this capital, get you set up. And that's where a big chunk, probably the largest chunk of the cannabis revenue is going to go.
I believe it's 20 or 25%. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure of the exact percentage, but that was all very intentional. Like that was something that was going to be part of the bill. It wasn't happening without that. And another portion, I think, goes to mental health programs, and another portion would go to funding expungements for people that have been incarcerated or charged.
Yeah, you know, and there's the geographic areas. They are mainly in Chicago. They're not all in Chicago. There's some here in Springfield. I believe the village of Jerome is pretty much covered. At least that has been an area that's been identified by the state as disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs, and that may well be because there had been an apartment complex that had been subject to some issues there that no longer exists, that has been renovated. But you look at other states, what they've brought in for cannabis revenue. In Washington State, for example, much smaller than Illinois. In 2017, $341 million.
Yeah, but see, that's I would not accept that at face value unless I knew. Is this all the money that they brought in, or is this just a half of it that goes into their general funds, and other dollars are being funneled off somewhere else? Because that's what
their
Illinois
excise tax.
does.
That's their excise tax. But the lesson there is that was in 2017. Now they're going down. In other words, they've peaked, And as cannabis becomes more prevalent, legal cannabis becomes more legalized in more places, they've seen a fairly dramatic decrease in their excise taxes for marijuana, at least in that state. And so the idea here is we'll start slow, intentionally start slow and build up and gradually build up so that we can, at one point, projections as high as $500 million a year. And that's total, that's some to the general fund, some to the programs that we've discussed here. And I wonder if that's actually going to happen in the out years as other states. Michigan is one that I think is already, they already have legalized, as other states get more into the cannabis game.
Well, the other end of that is they believe that as the implementation goes down, price might come down because there's more of it.
Yeah.
And you're phasing out some of the black market too. A lot of people, from what I understand, are still buying from their dealers. And they phase that out in the future, and there's more revenue to be had there too, in that extent.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it was just the start here in terms of this is my budget presentation. They never stay the same. Do you folks have any sense as to what is most likely going to be tweaked? What are the most likely targets here to be adjusted in terms of expenditures?
I'm guessing K-12 education will get the $350 million in any budget circumstance.
Okay, all right. Well,
and I'm thinking one way to do it would be just say, okay, we were going to delay paying group health insurance for employees. We're going to delay it another couple weeks, and that'll make up the difference.
Okay. All right, well, fair enough, and we're out of time. So thanks for joining us here on Capitol View, and we'll see you next week.